There is a particular numbness that arrives after the world breaks. It's not an absence of feeling, but a concentration of it, distilled into a cold, hard point behind your ribs. I know that place intimately now. He built a secret life with the pieces of mine. The betrayal wasn't a moment. It was an architecture, designed and documented. He took more than money or trust. He took the version of myself I believed in. The foundation of every memory, every plan, turned to dust. I was left standing in the ruins of a life I thought was ours. So I stopped crying. I started reading. I learned his system, every rule he lived by. And then I used it. Page by page, transaction by transaction, I began to unwind the very life he thought he'd secured. This is how you dismantle a giant with his own blueprints. My name is Claire. Before the numbness, before the cold point behind my ribs, I was someone else. I was a person who believed in structures, in spreadsheets that balanced, in retirement plans that matured, in the quiet, predictable arc of a well-managed life. My name is Claire, and I was a financial controller. I found profound comfort in the fact that everything, when properly understood, could be tracked, accounted for, and filed away. My life was that system. Mark was part of that system. We met at a professional development seminar. Of all places, he wasn't in finance. He was in commercial real estate. He appreciated my mind, he said. He loved how I could see the framework of things. Our courtship felt like a mutually beneficial merger. Efficient, joyful, but always sensible. We built a life with the same deliberate care. We bought a Victorian terrace house that needed work, and we restored it room by room, budget line by budget line. We had a joint 5-year plan. We had a color-coded shared calendar. Our trust wasn't a fiery, passionate thing. It was the quiet hum of a server in the next room, reliable and always on. I trusted him like I trusted my own calculations. The early warning signs, in retrospect, were not signs of a hidden affair or a secret addiction. They were erosions of that system, small accounting errors in the ledger of our life. It started with the calendar. He began using a separate one on his phone. Work is just too chaotic. It'll clutter our shared one, he explained. It was reasonable. I did the same with sensitive mergers at my firm. Then it was the passwords. Our shared password manager, once synced seamlessly, would show his entries as updated, but when I'd click, it would require a secondary authentication he'd forgotten to give me. "Security, Claire?" he'd say, kissing my forehead. "You of all people should understand layered security." There was a distance, but it was dressed in the fabric of our daily lives. Conversations became more logistical than connective. Did the mortgage payment go through? Did you schedule the roof inspection? The easy silence we used to share started to feel empty, not peaceful. I told myself this was what long-term marriage became: a partnership, a quiet company. I poured myself deeper into my work, into managing the house, into the structure of us, believing the substance would follow. The first physical tremor was the office, the small third bedroom we'd set up as a shared study. He began working later in there. The door closed. He said he was brokering a complex overseas deal. The time zones were brutal. One Saturday, I went in to vacuum. His desk, usually a monument to his particular brand of organized chaos, was startlingly bare. The drawers were locked. The filing cabinet we'd bought together had a new, smaller padlock on it. My own key no longer fit. My heart did a funny, sluggish beat. I stood there, the vacuum humming pointlessly. This wasn't security. This was sequestration. I asked him about it that evening, over a chicken roast I'd prepared because it was his favorite, because some part of me was already trying to bargain with a situation I didn't understand. "The deal is highly sensitive," he said, not looking up from his plate. "The client required NDAs for physical documents. It's a temporary thing. Don't take it personally. I took it personally. The system was failing. My trust, the server hum, began to sound like a warning whine. The revelation didn't come in a dramatic confrontation. It came on a Tuesday. He was away for a supposed overnight site visit. The house felt vast and echoing. That cold, hard point behind my ribs had been forming for weeks, and it ached. I wasn't a confrontational person. I was an investigator, a controller. I stood in front of the locked filing cabinet in the office. It was an old fireproof thing, heavy and green. I remembered us buying it. For our important documents, we'd said. Titles, wills, insurance policies. Our life in a box. The lock was cheap. A feeling of profound detachment came over me. This wasn't snooping. This was an audit. My hands were perfectly steady. A paperclip and a small torque wrench from a DIY set did the job in under 30 seconds. The metallic snick was obscenely loud in the quiet room. I opened the first drawer. Neat, suspended files, our house deeds, his car paperwork, my professional certifications, all normal. The second drawer was heavier. I pulled it open. The first files were labeled with the names of holding companies I didn't recognize. I flipped one open. Property deeds. For a flat in the city center. A nice one. Purchased 18 months prior. My breath hitched. I pulled another. Invoices from interior designers, furniture stores, high-end appliance retailers. All dated after the purchase. A cold sweat bloomed across my back. This wasn't a work deal. This was an asset. A hidden, fully furnished asset. My hands began to move faster, the professional in me taking over, compartmentalizing the earthquake happening inside my body. I found a file simply labeled M. Inside were bank statements, not from our joint account, not from his known personal account, a new, separate account. The deposits were regular, substantial, and from our joint business account, a modest limited company we'd set up for rental income from a small property my grandmother had left me. He managed it. I saw transfers out, to the mortgage account for the flat, to the furnishing stores. He was funding a secret life with our shared money. But it was the last document, paper-clipped to the back of the M file, that stopped the world. It was a photocopy of a life insurance policy. My life insurance policy. The one we'd taken out together when we got the mortgage. Claire Elizabeth Arden. There was a bright yellow sticky note on it, in his handwriting. The familiar, looping scrawl I'd seen on 1,000 shopping lists, on love notes left on the fridge in a different lifetime. The note said, surrender value approx, $85K, check clause 4B payout triggers, accelerate? Below that, a single underlined name. A woman's name, not mine. The air left the room. A high-pitched ringing started in my ears. I couldn't feel my fingers. I stared at the note, at that word. Accelerate. I understood structures. I understood clauses. I understood financial instruments and triggers and payouts. The definitions were never emotional. They were cold, legal facts. Accelerate. He wasn't just stealing from our life to build another one. He was looking at my death as a financial event, a liquidity event, a trigger for a payout. He was calculating its value, its timing, and he was linking it in writing to another woman's name. I dropped the paper. It fluttered to the carpet, silent and weightless. I backed away from the open drawer, from the evidence of my own obliteration, until my shoulders hit the wall. I slid down it, the textured wallpaper catching on my sweater. I wrapped my arms around my knees, making myself small. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat on the floor of the office we had painted together, in the house we had restored together, and I felt the final, total collapse of every structure I had ever believed in. The server was not just offline, it had never existed. The hum had been a lie. The shock was so complete, so physically arresting that for a long time the only thing I could hear was the deafening, silent roar of the vacuum where my life used to be. I don't know how long I sat on the floor. Time became granular, measured in the slow crawl of a shadow from the window across the carpet. The shock didn't fade. It hardened. It solidified into a sheet of ice between me and the world. I carefully placed every document back into the filing cabinet, relocked it with the same paperclip. I moved through the house like a ghost, performing the mundane rituals of an ending day, washing the dish from my uneaten dinner, turning off lights, brushing my teeth. My reflection in the bathroom mirror was a stranger's face, pale, composed, utterly vacant. I went to bed in the guest room. The thought of lying in our bed, the bed he would return to tomorrow, made my stomach heave. The emotional fallout was not tears. It was a silent, seismic deconstruction. I dissected 11 years with a clinical, horrific precision. Every holiday, every quiet Sunday, every whispered plan in the dark. Had it been a performance? Had I been a line item in a budget? The self-doubt was venomous. Was I so unlovable? The question echoed, not as self-pity, but as a brutal audit. Had my focus on order, on control, driven him to this? I scrutinized my own behavior, my body, my conversation, searching for the flaw that justified this. The guilt was perverse. I felt guilty for discovering his crime, for violating the privacy of his betrayal. He returned the next afternoon, his keys jingling in the lock. "Honey, I'm back," he called, his voice the same familiar baritone. I was at the kitchen island, reviewing a spreadsheet for work. I watched my own hand move the mouse, click, save. "In here," I called back, and my voice didn't crack. It was flat, acceptable. He came in, dropped his bag, came to kiss my cheek. I didn't flinch. The smell of him, his shampoo, his skin, once the scent of home, now smelled of evidence. "Good trip?" I asked. "Exhausting. These developers are vultures." He poured himself a glass of water, leaning against the counter. He looked tired, ordinary. A man who had maybe cheated on his wife. Not a man who had noted the surrender value of her life. First revelation. I had to know who she was. It wasn't jealousy, it was taxonomy. I needed to classify the threat. A few days later, using his laptop when he'd left it open, password, our old dog's name, a sentimental oversight, I found her. Not through social media, but through a cached search in his browser history. UK marriage license verification. The search was dated 8 months ago. My blood turned to slush. I followed the digital breadcrumbs to a government portal page he'd left open. With trembling hands, I entered the woman's name from the sticky note, Ilara Vance. The result loaded. A marriage certificate, registered 16 months ago. The groom, Mark Timothy Arden. The bride, Ilara Marie Vance. The date was 3 weeks after our supposed second honeymoon in Crete. I remembered that trip. He'd been distracted, on his phone constantly. Closing a big deal, he'd said. He hadn't just betrayed me. He had committed a crime, bigamy, a full, legal, documented second marriage. I was not merely replaced. I was invalidated. My marriage, the cornerstone of my adult life, was a legal fiction. The floor didn't just drop out from under me. The entire house of my identity was revealed to be built on rotten pilings. I was a mistress in my own home, a financial partner to a bigamist. The weight of it pressed the air from my lungs. This was the first true layer of the ruin. Second revelation. The financial damage began to clarify. I began a forensic audit of our finances, but from the shadows. I created a new, encrypted cloud drive. I took photos of every statement, every login screen. I started with our joint business account, the one for my grandmother's rental property. The transfers I'd seen were just the tip. He had been systematically overinflating management fees, creating invoices for non-existent repairs, siphoning off nearly 40% of the income for over 2 years. But it was our shared personal investment portfolio, the one I'd let him manage because he had the better broker, that revealed the deeper theft. He hadn't just withdrawn money, he had reallocated assets. Over the last 3 years, he had slowly sold off the stable, long-term index funds I had carefully selected and used the capital to purchase high-risk, volatile stocks in a company that, upon my investigation, was a shell. Its registered address was a mailbox service. Its director, an alias. But the service was paid for from an account I traced back to Alara Vance. He wasn't just stealing our money. He was laundering it through a fabricated company, moving it from our pot into a completely separate, controlled one. He was fabricating losses on paper while the money bled into his other life. The reputational damage was silent but profound. To any outsider, to a future court, it would look like a series of poor joint investment decisions. My professional pride screamed. He was using my own domain, my world of numbers and logic, to defile me. The confusion was a constant fog. How could the man who brought me tea in bed, who remembered my mother's birthday, be this other person? The cognitive dissonance was physically painful. I split him in two. Mark, my husband, a familiar ghost, and Arden, the strategist, a cold-hearted CEO of a secret life. I was married to the ghost and being dismantled by the CEO. Third revelation. It involved my family. My mother, a kind, somewhat naive woman, adored Mark. He'd helped her refinance her small home 2 years ago to get her a better rate. A leaden suspicion formed. I called her, my voice light, asking for the details of the loan, saying I was updating my files. She happily sent over the paperwork. My professional eye saw it immediately. It wasn't a standard refinance. It was an equity release product, complex and with high fees. The broker listed was a firm I didn't recognize. A little digging showed it was a subsidiary of the shell company. He hadn't just stolen from me. He had leveraged my mother's trust, her only real asset, and taken a commission from the fees. He had made money from my widowed mother's house. The betrayal was no longer confined to us. It had tentacles. It had reached out and quietly siphoned from the people I loved most, turning their affection for him into a revenue stream. The quiet, heavy horror of that sat in my chest like a stone. Fourth revelation. The most intimate violation. I was searching for a utility bill in our filing cabinet, the legitimate one in the hallway, when I found an old envelope marked medical. I assumed it was his vasectomy paperwork from 5 years ago. We'd made the decision together, or so I thought. It was rational. We were focused on our careers, our life. He'd had the procedure. I'd driven him home. The paper inside was not a vasectomy confirmation. It was a receipt from a private clinic for a sperm storage and viability analysis, dated 6 months after his supposed surgery. The result field read, sample viable, normal motility and count. I read it once, twice, 10 times. He hadn't had a vasectomy. He'd had a consultation, perhaps even a fake procedure. He had lied. For 5 years, he had let me believe we were a child-free unit by choice, by mutual design. He had let me take the blame with my family, who gently lamented their lack of grandchildren. He had held me during my occasional private waves of late-night doubt about that choice, soothing me, telling me we'd made the right decision. All the while, he was fertile, preserving his options for his other life. For Alara, this wasn't a financial crime. This was a theft of my autonomy, of my body's potential, of a fundamental truth about our life together. He had controlled the most intimate choice a couple can make, based on a lie. The guilt I'd been carrying, the guilt over my supposed coldness, my focus on career over family, dissolved, replaced by a pure incandescent rage so profound it was utterly silent. It burned behind my eyes, but no tears came. This lie was the root. It wasn't about money first. It was about keeping me contained, manageable, unencumbered. A streamlined asset, not a mother. A partner in a business, not the family he might have wanted with her. I filed the paper away. My hands were steady. The ice in my core was now permafrost. The emotional fallout was complete. I was through the confusion, the self-doubt, the guilt. All that remained was the cold, clear landscape of the truth. He had not made a mistake. He had built an alternative life on the plundered ruins of mine, and he had started by ensuring I would never create anything with him that could complicate his exit. I was a line item. I was a financial instrument. I was a clause in a contract, and I finally understood my role. I was not the victim, not anymore. I was the auditor, and his books were a disaster. The rage settled. It didn't disappear, it decanted. The fiery, screaming fury clarified into something dense, potent, and still. It became a fuel I would ration. I made a decision that night, standing in the shower with water so hot it turned my skin red. I would not become him. My revenge would not be an explosion. It would be an erosion. It would be legal, precise, and it would use the very thing he thought made me weak. My need for order, for the system. The first step was silence. I became a master of observation. I noted the times he lied about being at the gym, mapping them against the travel time to the city center flat. I listened to his phone calls in the next room, not to the words, but to his tone, the particular, softer cadence he used with her. I became an archivist of his deceit, collecting timestamps and receipts not with heartbreak, but with the detached focus of a researcher studying a dangerous species. The planning was slow, painfully slow. It began not with action, but with education. I needed to understand the full architecture of his crime. Using my professional credentials, I accessed land registry databases, company house filings, and public financial records. I built a parallel set of books. On one side, our apparent life. On the other, his shadow life. I charted every connection, from our joint business account, to the shell company, to the flat's mortgage, to Alara Vance's personal account. I created a flowchart so detailed it looked like the schematic for a complex machine. It was the machine that had consumed my life. The moral conflict was quiet, but constant. It wasn't about whether he deserved it, he did. It was about what it would turn me into. There were moments of weakness, of imagined shortcuts. I found the website for the regulatory body governing his real estate license. One anonymous report detailing mortgage fraud and bigamy would end his career. I drafted the email 3 times, but I deleted it each time. That was anger. That was exposure. It was too fast. Too chaotic. It would create a drama where he could paint himself as the victim of a vengeful wife. It would force a confrontation before I was ready. More importantly, it felt crude. Another night, I saw his phone light up with a message from her on his bedside table. A preview flashed. "Can't wait for Friday. This will be our first proper anniversary trip." A corrosive, almost physical urge washed over me to pick it up, to type a reply, to burn his second world down with a few keystrokes. My hand actually twitched, but I turned over. That was impulse. That was his territory. I chose truth over anger. The truth was a slower, heavier weapon, but it was indestructible. My hesitation wasn't out of mercy. It was strategy. I needed to be untouchable. Any action I took had to be beyond legal reproach, so far above board it would be unimpeachable. I would not hack. I would not steal. I would not slander. I would follow the money and I would let the documents speak. My revenge would be a perfectly executed audit, with consequences delivered not by me but by the cold, impartial world of law and finance he thought he'd mastered. The first tangible move was passive, almost invisible. I stopped contributing, not obviously. I began a gentle financial starvation of our joint life. When he suggested a costly kitchen renovation, I demurred. The market's looking uncertain. Let's preserve liquidity. He couldn't argue. He'd said the same thing to me for years. I let small subscriptions lapse. I bought supermarket own brand instead of premium. I cited economic anxiety, the need to bolster our savings. It was all perfectly reasonable, wifely caution. Meanwhile, I quietly opened a new separate bank account at a different institution and began siphoning my salary into it, leaving only enough in our joint account to cover my half of the bills. I was becoming a ghost in my own financial life. The second move was reclamation. I focused on my mother's situation. I went to her, not with accusations, but with concern. Mom, I've been looking at newer equity release products. I think Mark got you a good deal at the time, but the market has changed. Let me help you refinance again, just to be sure. With her blessing, I engaged a solicitor I chose, and a financial advisor I vetted. We untangled her from the product he'd placed her in. The process revealed the excessive fees clearly, mathematically. I showed her the numbers, not the malice behind them. She was upset, but at the faceless finance company, not at her son-in-law. I didn't correct her. I had severed his tentacle from her. That was enough. It was a small, quiet victory that warmed the permafrost inside me by 1 degree. The planning required patience of a kind I'd never exercised. I had to watch him live his double life, funded in part by what was still legally my money. I had to smile at his jokes, listen to his work stories, all while knowing he was returning from a second wedding anniversary trip. The restraint was a physical discipline, like holding a difficult yoga pose for months on end. It forged a new kind of strength in me, a strength of omission, of silence, of knowing more than you reveal. I realized my ultimate goal wasn't to hurt him out of spite. That was a fleeting satisfaction. My goal was dissolution, the careful, legal, and total dissolution of every structure he'd built using me as his foundation. I wanted our marriage, his second marriage, his financial schemes, and his professional facade to be unveiled not as scandals, but as interlocking pieces of fraud. I wanted the system, the real system of laws and regulations, to do what it was designed to do, punish deceit. I began to consult, not lawyers yet, but legal textbooks. I studied family law, property law, and fraud statutes. I needed to understand the exact thresholds, the precise definitions. I wasn't building a case for a dramatic courtroom scene. I was building a trap where the walls were made of his own signatures, his own filings, his own financial transfers. The final piece of the plan crystallized one evening as I watched him explain a complicated property deal to me using a napkin to draw diagrams. He was so confident, so persuasive, he believed his own intelligence made him invisible. He was wrong. His intelligence was his pattern, and patterns are predictable. I finally knew how to begin the true unraveling. It wouldn't start with a fight. It would start with a document served by a third party. It would start with a calm, written query from a financial regulator, triggered by an anonymous, impeccably sourced tip about irregularities in a shell company's filings. It would start the clock ticking in a world he couldn't charm or lie his way out of. The world of facts and figures. I went to bed that night beside my sleeping husband, my heart not racing, but beating with a slow, steady, inexorable rhythm. The patience was no longer a burden, it was a power. The revenge was no longer a desire, it was an inevitability, waiting for its perfect, lawful moment to be born. The first crack appeared not with a bang, but with a certified letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, addressed to Mark at our home. I saw it on the hall table, its official envelope stark against the polished wood. He opened it that evening, his confident expression dissolving into a frown. "Probably nothing," he muttered, but his knuckles were white around the paper. It was a notice from the Financial Conduct Authority, requesting clarification on specific transactions linked to a shell company's filings. A routine inquiry, the letter stressed. But I knew the transaction IDs listed. They were the ones that led from our business account to the flat's furnishings. He spent the next 2 nights in his locked office, getting ahead of it. I heard the low, frantic murmur of phone calls, the sharp tap of keys. His performance at dinner grew brittle. He'd lecture about bureaucratic overreach, his eyes never quite meeting mine. I'd nod, sip my water, and say, "I'm sure it's just a formality." The system had been nudged. The first domino was teetering. The exposure happened in layers, each one peeling back a different part of his life. The professional layer. The regulatory inquiry was a stone dropped in a pond. The ripples reached his firm. A week later, his senior partner called him into a closed-door meeting. Mark came home early, his face the color of putty. "They've put me on administrative leave," he said, pouring a whiskey without asking if I wanted one. "Pending review. Some compliance nonsense about conflict of interest with personal investments." He was spinning it, but the panic was right beneath the surface. His reputation at the firm, built on being a steady, trustworthy dealmaker, was now stamped with an internal investigation. He was toxic, and in his world, perception was capital. I offered quiet sympathy, the concerned wife. Inside, I noted the flaw in his armor. He needed his professional legitimacy to maintain access to the financial networks that fed his secret life. Without it, he was just a man with a lot of explaining to do. The financial layer. With his income suspended, the architecture of his double life began to groan under its own weight. I watched, silent, as the strain manifested. He became obsessed with our finances, suddenly eager to consolidate and liquidate. He suggested we cash in the investment portfolio, the very one he'd bled dry. "We need the liquidity, Claire," he insisted, his voice tight. "Of course," I said, "but let's do it properly. We should get independent valuations on everything, given the market volatility. Transparency will protect us." He couldn't argue. My reasonableness was a cage. Ordering the valuations meant forensic accountants would look at the shell company holdings. The fabricated losses would be exposed not as poor choices, but as potential fraud. He delayed. He prevaricated. But the pressure was mounting from two sides now, the regulator and his own crumbling cash flow. The social layer. This was the quietest and perhaps the most satisfying collapse. It began with my mother. Having refinanced her loan elsewhere, she'd mentioned it casually to a friend in their book club who happened to be married to a financial advisor. The story of the overpriced equity release product spread in hushed, concerned tones through their circle. Mark was no longer the golden son-in-law who handled things. He was the one who'd put an old lady in a dodgy product. I saw the change at a neighborhood barbecue. The usual backslapping bonhomie directed his way was cooler, more reserved. Questions about work were met with vague, pitying smiles. His reputation was leaching away in whispers, not shouts. The legal layer. This was the culmination. I did not file for divorce. Not yet. Instead, acting on the advice of a discreet solicitor I'd retained using my separate funds, I filed a formal notice of severance on our joint tenancy of the house, converting it to a tenancy in common. It was a dry legal procedure. It meant he could not sell or remortgage the house without my signature. When the papers arrived for him to sign, he stared at them as if they were written in another language. "What is this?" he asked, his voice hollow. "It's a precaution, Mark," I said, my tone level, rehearsed. "With all this regulatory uncertainty and your income suspended, I'm worried about creditors. This protects the house. It's just a technicality." I used his own language, risk management, asset protection. He signed, too distracted by the other fires to see the significance. He had just given up unilateral control of his primary asset. I had legally fortified my position. The final, most personal truth emerged because of a simple, automated process. With his credit cards strained from maintaining 2 households, a final demand for council tax on the city center flat was sent to the address on file, our address. It was a mistake by the automated system, a piece of pure, bureaucratic truth. I opened it. I placed it on the kitchen island next to his coffee cup one morning. He froze when he saw it. The color drained from his face completely. All the lies, the business trips, the separate life, the second marriage, were reduced to this one piece of paper. this demand for 1,842.76 for a property at 22B, the carriage house, payable by Mr. M. Arden and Mrs. E. Vance. He didn't speak. He just looked from the bill to my face, searching for the hysterics, the tears, the explosion he could deflect or mollify. I met his gaze. I said nothing. I simply picked up my own mug and took a sip of tea. The silence was absolute, and in it, every lie he'd ever told screamed until it was hoarse. "It's not what it looks like," he finally croaked, the words pathetic and thin in the quiet kitchen. "I know exactly what it is," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle. "It's a council tax bill for a property owned by Mark Arden and Alara Vance. The land registry shows a purchase 18 months ago. The company's house register shows you as a director of a shell company that made payments to the vendor. Our joint business account funded the deposits. The FCA is investigating the transactions. Your firm has placed you on leave." I listed the facts, one after another, dry, indisputable, and lethal. His mouth opened and closed. The master strategist, the charismatic dealmaker, had nothing. His fiction couldn't withstand the audit. "The bigamy," I added, almost as an afterthought. "That's a criminal offense, of course. A simple search of the public records is quite enlightening." He crumpled. Not with anger, but with a sudden, total deflation. The performance was over. There was no audience left to convince. The facts had done what my anger never could. They had stripped him bare. "I can explain," he whispered. "You don't need to," I said, putting my mug down with a soft click. "The documents explain everything." I walked out of the kitchen, leaving him standing there with the incriminating paper. There was no dramatic exit. I went upstairs to the guest room, now permanently my room, and closed the door. I sat at the small desk and looked at the flowchart on my laptop, the beautiful, terrible schematic of his deceit. One by one, I began to change the status of each connecting line from active to exposed. The consequences would now unfold naturally. The regulator would find fraud. The firm would dismiss him. The mortgage lender for the flat would call in the loan. Alara Vance, I suspected, would find her dream life evaporating in a cloud of debt and scandal. My revenge was not in hurting him. It was in removing myself from the equation entirely, leaving him alone in the crumbling ruin of his own design, with every lie documented, every betrayal filed in triplicate. The truth was no longer a secret I carried. It was a public record, and it was infinitely more destructive than any scene I could have ever made. The unraveling was not an event, but a season. A long, quiet autumn where every leaf of his deception detached and fell in perfect order to the ground. The regulatory inquiry became a formal investigation. The dry, complex letters from the FCA were joined by notices from HMRC, questioning the financial flows of the shell company. Mark's world shrunk to the locked office, a cave of panic and ringing phones. I heard him pleading with solicitors, his voice a strained, unfamiliar thread. "It's a misunderstanding, a paperwork error." The professional charm had curdled into desperate negotiation. He was no longer explaining to me. He was explaining to the immutable logic of the state. His reputation was no longer merely damaged, it was a liability. His firm made it official with a terse legal letter delivered by courier. His contract was terminated, citing gross misconduct and failure to comply with fiduciary duties. The paper was a guillotine blade, silent and final. The financial consequences were arithmetic and therefore brutal. With no income and multiple investigations, his credit shattered. The mortgage on the flat was called in. He tried to remortgage our home, but my severance of the joint tenancy stood like a wall. He couldn't touch it. I watched him try to sell the flat's expensive furnishings, but it was a fire sale, pennies on the pound. Every asset of his shadow life was repossessed or sold to pay debts he'd never believed would surface. Alara Vance left him. I learned this not from him, but from a change in the land registry. The flat was sold in a distressed sale to cover the mortgage shortfall. Her name was removed from all associated documents. I pictured it, the dream collapsing under the weight of bailiff's notices and reality. She had married a successful man with a portfolio. She was left with a man facing fraud charges and bankruptcy. She became the final piece of his life to calculate her loss and walk away. The bigamy, the most intimate of his crimes, was the last truth to become public knowledge. I did not report it. It emerged through the divorce proceedings. My solicitor, a steely woman named Fiona who appreciated clean facts, included the marriage certificate to Alara Vance in our financial disclosure, noting the clear conflict and criminal implication. It was a single line in a 100-page document. It was a fact presented without emphasis. When Mark's lawyer saw it, the negotiations, which had been stubborn and bitter, ceased entirely. They moved from settlement to surrender. We met, finally, in Fiona's office to sign the papers. It was the first time I'd seen him in weeks. He looked smaller, eroded. His suit was sharp, but it hung on him like a costume. The confidence was gone, replaced by a twitchy exhaustion. He glanced at me, seeking something: anger, pity, a remnant of the woman he thought he knew. I gave him nothing, just a polite, distant nod, as if acknowledging an acquaintance. His consequences were laid bare in the settlement agreement. He walked away with nothing but his personal debts and his car. I kept the house, free and clear, its mortgage paid off using what remained of the salvaged joint investments after the fraudulent transactions were reversed. He signed away any claim to my future earnings, to my pension. He even agreed to a legally binding admission of financial misconduct within our marriage, a document that would exist in perpetuity. He signed it all, his signature a shaky scrawl. It wasn't a fight. It was a signing over of spoils, after a war he hadn't realized he was losing until his army had deserted. After the last page was initialed, Fiona left us alone for a moment, a procedural formality. The air in the room was cold and still. "You destroyed me," he said, his voice a dry rasp. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, the only one he seemed to have left. "No," I said, looking at him fully for the first time. "I stopped you from destroying me. What you're facing isn't my destruction. It's the consequence of your own architecture. I just stopped being the foundation. I loved you in my way," he offered, a last hollow coin from his empty pocket. "Your way was a currency I couldn't spend," I replied. It was counterfeit. I stood, gathered my coat and bag. There was nothing else to say. The truth had said it all. He remained seated, a man in a chair in a lawyer's office, staring at the polished table that reflected a hollowed-out version of himself. The finality did not come with a bang, but with the soft thud of an envelope landing on my doormat. It was the decree absolute. The marriage of Claire Elizabeth Arden to Mark Timothy Arden was dissolved. It was a single sheet of paper. It held the same legal weight as the marriage certificate it nullified. I filed it in my new fireproof cabinet in the section labeled Personal. The karma was not poetic. It was administrative. He was charged with fraud by false representation. The criminal case would grind on for years, a slow public erosion of everything he had been. His name, when searched online, would forever be associated with the court case first, his career second. He became a cautionary tale in his own industry. For me, there was no victory party, no triumphant new hairstyle or wild holiday. The silence in the house, once so terrifying, became a neutral space. It was no longer the silence of absence, but the silence of peace. I repainted the office where he'd kept his locked cabinet. I turned it into a reading room. The moral reckoning was internal and quiet. I had not forgiven him. Forgiveness felt like another currency he didn't deserve. Instead, I achieved a state of profound indifference. He became a fact of my history, like a childhood illness or a former address. The emotion attached to him was meticulously archived, a closed case. One afternoon, months later, I was in the garden. It was early spring. I was planting a magnolia tree, its bare branches promising future blossoms. My hands were in the earth, the soil cool and real. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification from a news app, a short legal update. Former real estate broker pleads guilty to 3 counts of fraud in FCA case, sentencing adjourned. I read it. I felt nothing. No thrill, no sorrow. It was just another piece of data entering the ecosystem of settled facts. I wiped my hands on my trousers, put the phone away, and went back to tamping the soil around the young tree. ensuring its roots had something solid to hold on to. The revenge was complete. It was not a feeling. It was a state of being. I had used his own system, his love of secrets, his reliance on documents, his belief that complexity could conceal truth, to unravel our life. And from that unraveling, I had not knitted a new version of the old dream. I had simply stepped away from the loom, leaving the tangled threads behind, and found the air outside to be clean and breathable, and mine. I stood, looking at the freshly planted tree, at the house that was now just a house, not a monument to a lie. The silence was full, not empty. It was the sound of a story being over. The last confession is this: I did not get my old life back. That life was a story he was telling me. I got the truth instead. And in the end, the truth is the only thing you can truly own. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like finally being able to close a very heavy book and walk away from the shelf forever.